You're 4 tabs deep into the same flight search, and the seat map just loaded, and it's almost entirely red. One seat left at a price you'd accept, a middle seat, second to last row, wedged between 2 strangers. Everything else on the plane is either sold or costs $40 more to sit in. Your chest does a small thing it wasn't doing 30 seconds ago. You didn't feel that a minute ago when you were just browsing dates. You feel it now, staring at a map covered in red. And here's what should bother you about that feeling. It wasn't really about the seats. It was never about the seats. And it didn't start with airlines. Because that map and the price that just quietly moved up $11 since this morning, and the base fare that looked so reasonable an hour ago and now has 4 separate charges stacked underneath it, none of that happened by accident. And none of it existed 40 years ago. Not because the technology wasn't there, because the law wouldn't let it exist. Before 1978, if you wanted to fly from Chicago to Los Angeles, the price was the price. It was set by a federal body called the Civil Aeronautics Board, and every airline flying that route charged essentially the same fare, because they were legally required to. Airlines couldn't compete on price at all. They competed on food, on legroom, on how nice the flight attendants were, on the size of the seats, because price was completely off the table as a variable, which, in hindsight, might have been the calmest era of commercial air travel that has ever existed. Then, in 1978, Congress passed the Airline Deregulation Act, and overnight, airlines were free to set prices however they wanted, whenever they wanted, based on whatever they wanted. For the first time in the industry's history, an airline could charge 2 people sitting next to each other on the same flight 2 completely different amounts. And this is the part that should genuinely unsettle you a little, because 1 year after that law passed, in 1979, 2 psychologists named Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky published a paper that would eventually reshape the entire field of economics. It was called Prospect Theory, and buried inside a fairly dense academic paper was a finding so simple it sounds almost too obvious to matter. Losing something feels roughly twice as intense, psychologically, as gaining the exact same thing feels good, not slightly more intense, roughly double. They proved it with careful, repeated experiments asking people to choose between guaranteed amounts and risky bets. And the pattern held up again and again. People will go to much greater lengths to avoid a loss than they will to acquire an equivalent gain. Kahneman would go on to win the Nobel Prize in Economics for this work in 2002, largely because it explained so much human behavior that classical economics had simply gotten wrong for 100 years. So you've got an industry that just gained total freedom to manipulate pricing in any way it wants, arriving at almost the exact same moment science proved in careful, repeatable detail precisely how the human brain reacts to the fear of losing something. Nobody needs to accuse anyone of a conspiracy here. The paper was public, the freedom was legal, and it didn't take long for someone inside the industry to notice the opportunity sitting right in front of them. It's worth pausing on how deep this actually runs, because loss aversion isn't a quirk of human culture. It's closer to a law of nature than a marketing trick. A Yale economist named Keith Chen spent time in the mid-2000s teaching capuchin monkeys to use small metal discs as a kind of currency, trading them with researchers for pieces of food. And once the monkeys understood the system, they displayed the exact same loss-averse behavior human subjects show in economics experiments, going out of their way to avoid a bad trade far more than they'd go out of their way to chase an equally good one. In one especially memorable moment, a monkey grabbed an entire tray of tokens and hurled it back at the researchers, rather than accept a trade it didn't like, which either says something profound about the deep evolutionary roots of loss aversion, or is simply the most relatable thing a monkey has ever done on camera. Either way, the airline industry didn't invent the fear of losing something. It just found one of the most efficient ways yet built to point that fear directly at your wallet. That someone was an American Airlines executive named Robert Crandall, and in the early 1980s, he pioneered something the industry now calls yield management, though you'd probably know it better by its modern name, dynamic pricing. Crandall's insight was that an empty airplane seat is a perishable good, worth nothing the moment the plane takes off, which meant the airline should be willing to sell that seat for almost any price rather than fly with it empty, while simultaneously charging business travelers who booked last minute as much as the system could possibly extract from them, because those travelers had the least flexibility and the least price sensitivity of anyone on the plane. American Airlines built entire software systems around this idea, adjusting fares in something close to real time based on how a flight was selling. And the results were significant enough that competitors had no real choice but to copy it within a few years. Crandall is often credited, only half-jokingly, within the industry itself, as the person who invented modern airline pricing as you experience it today, decades before anyone had heard the term dynamic pricing applied to anything else, which is a strange legacy to carry into history, somewhere between Airline Hall of Fame and the reason you're currently sweating over a seat map. Once that system existed, the rest of the booking experience started getting engineered around it, piece by piece. The first edition is what people in the industry now call drip pricing, and you felt it even if you didn't have a name for it. The base fare that shows up in your search results looks almost suspiciously cheap. Then you click through and a seat costs extra. Then a bag costs extra. Then priority boarding costs extra. Then, on some airlines, even speaking to a human customer service agent instead of a chatbot costs extra, which feels less like a fee and more like a small toll charged specifically for wanting to talk to another person. Each fee on its own feels small enough to shrug off. $20 here, $15 there, and that's precisely the point. Because your brain's pain of paying response doesn't spike the same way over 5 small charges as it would over one large number presented all at once. Airline ancillary fees, the industry's own term for all of this add-on revenue, now bring in tens of billions of dollars a year globally. And the entire business model has quietly shifted from selling flights to selling the bare minimum of a flight, and charging separately for everything that used to just be included. That shift eventually produced its own dedicated product, because in 2017, American Airlines introduced a new fare class called Basic Economy, explicitly designed to compete with budget carriers that had started eating into their lowest-price customers. The trick was that Basic Economy needed to look cheap enough to win the comparison, while being just uncomfortable enough that a meaningful number of travelers would pay more to avoid it entirely. So Basic Economy passengers typically get no seat selection, boarding in the very last group, and on many airlines, no ability to bring a full-size carry-on bag at all, only a small personal item that has to fit under the seat in front of you, which is a phrase that has ruined more backpack-related friendships than almost anything else in modern travel. Other major airlines rolled out nearly identical fare classes within a couple of years, because once one competitor demonstrated that a deliberately worse product could still generate meaningful revenue by scaring people into the tier above it, the entire industry adopted the same playbook almost immediately. Basic Economy isn't really a fare. It's a warning sign, priced to look like a bargain. And that checked bag fee specifically created a second, almost accidental problem, one that airlines noticed fairly quickly and then quietly turned into its own revenue stream. Once bags started costing $40 or $50 each way, people stopped checking them. Almost everyone started carrying on instead, which meant the overhead bins, designed for a plane where most passengers checked their luggage, suddenly had to hold nearly everyone's bag at once. You felt this exact anxiety if you've ever boarded in one of the later groups, walking down the aisle, watching bin after bin close in front of you, wondering if you're about to be the person who has to gate check a bag you specifically packed to avoid gate checking. Airlines noticed that anxiety too, and priced a direct solution to it, because priority boarding isn't really being sold as comfort or convenience anymore on most airlines. It's being sold, often quite explicitly in the marketing copy, as protection against exactly the scarcity the airline's own fee structure created in the first place. You're not paying to board early. You're paying to avoid a problem that didn't meaningfully exist before checked bags started costing money, which might be the closest the airline industry has ever come to selling you fire insurance while quietly holding a box of matches behind its back. The second addition to the booking flow is dynamic pricing tied to your own specific behavior, not just the flight's overall demand. And this one gets genuinely uncomfortable. Multiple airlines and travel sites have faced consumer complaints and lawsuits over allegations that prices rise the more times you search the same route, or based on your location, or even your specific device. Whether or not every version of this allegation holds up legally, the psychological effect is the same either way. Because the moment you believe the price is rising while you're still deciding, you stop deciding carefully and you start deciding urgently. That urgency isn't a byproduct. It's loss aversion, built directly into a search algorithm, running on infrastructure Robert Crandall's team could only have dreamed of in 1985. Which brings you back to that seat map, because now you can see exactly what it was actually doing to you. The color red wasn't a neutral design choice. It's the universal color of danger, of stop, of no. And a huge number of those red seats weren't even sold. They were simply unassigned, meaning the airline hadn't decided yet who gets them, meaning they were, in a very real sense, available. But available doesn't create urgency. Red does. The map was never really describing the state of the airplane. It was describing the state it wanted you to feel. This kind of manufactured urgency eventually got so aggressive across the entire travel booking industry, not just airlines, that regulators stepped in directly. In 2019, the UK's Competition and Markets Authority investigated major hotel and travel booking sites over messages like "only 2 rooms left," and 15 people are looking at this right now, and found that in a significant number of cases, these messages were either misleading, referred to room types rather than actual total availability, or in some cases, weren't tied to real inventory data at all. Several major booking platforms were forced to change how they displayed urgency messaging as a direct result. It was functionally a government body confirming what your body already suspected every time it saw a countdown timer or a low stock warning during checkout. And the pricing system got strange enough, once yield management fully took hold, that it started producing genuinely bizarre outcomes, the kind that eventually created their own small rebellion. Because fares are priced by route and by demand rather than by distance, it's not unusual for a ticket from, say, New York to Los Angeles with a layover in Dallas to cost less than a direct ticket from New York to Dallas alone, even though the second flight is physically shorter, a piece of pricing logic that makes sense to absolutely no one who has ever taken a basic math class. Enterprising travelers figured out you could book the cheaper connecting itinerary and simply not board the second leg, getting off at the layover city, a practice that came to be known as hidden city ticketing. A company called Skiplagged built an entire search engine specifically to help travelers find these fare loopholes, and in 2014, United Airlines and the booking site Orbitz sued Skiplagged directly, arguing the practice violated airline fare rules and caused financial harm. The case dragged on for years and largely fizzled out without a clean resolution, but the fact that a major airline felt it was worth suing a website over travelers finding cheaper legal fares tells you almost everything you need to know about how the pricing logic actually works underneath the surface. It was never really about distance or cost of service. It was about what the algorithm believed it could extract from a specific route. And a workaround that let people opt out of that extraction was treated less like a loophole and more like a threat. And then there's overbooking, which sounds like an accident until you learn how deliberate it actually is. Airlines routinely sell more tickets for a flight than there are physical seats on the plane, based on statistical models predicting how many passengers won't show up. Models that trace directly back to the same yield management thinking Crandall's team built decades ago. Most of the time, the math works out fine. Sometimes it doesn't, and passengers get bumped, sometimes voluntarily for compensation, sometimes not so voluntarily. This isn't a mistake anyone apologizes for internally, because it isn't a mistake. It's a calculated strategy that only became a formal industry-wide practice once airlines controlled their own pricing and inventory completely, which traces right back to that single piece of legislation in 1978 that started all of this. Eventually, the fee structure specifically drew exactly the kind of attention you'd expect, because it got bad enough that governments on 2 different continents stepped in. In 2024, the U.S. Department of Transportation finalized new rules specifically forcing airlines to disclose baggage and change fees upfront in the initial search results, rather than revealing them one at a time during checkout. A direct regulatory response to drip pricing that had gone on largely unchecked for years. The European Union took an earlier
and in some ways, more aggressive approach, with a law called EU 261, which mandates specific, enforceable cash compensation for passengers dealing with long delays or denied boarding.
A law that exists specifically because the industry never fixed this on its own, and the people who get hit hardest by all of this were never evenly distributed. Dynamic pricing spikes tend to punish last-minute travelers most severely, and last-minute travel is disproportionately made up of people dealing with emergencies, bereavement, urgent family situations, exactly the moments when someone has the least bandwidth to comparison shop and the least leverage to walk away. The industry didn't design a confusing booking process by accident. Robert Crandall built the engine on purpose in the early 1980s. Science had already explained exactly why it would work in 1979, and it took direct government intervention on two separate continents, decades later, just to claw back the most basic form of pricing transparency. So here's what you actually do the next time you're booking. Search in a private or incognito browser window, because it strips out a meaningful amount of the tracking that dynamic pricing algorithms use to profile you across repeated searches. The moment you find a fare you genuinely accept, screenshot it immediately, and treat that number as the real number, not a placeholder that's allowed to keep moving on you. Before you start the checkout process, do the full math yourself. Flight plus bag plus seat plus anything else you know you'll need, so the drip pricing never gets the chance to land one small, forgettable charge at a time. Look closely at whether that tempting low fare is actually basic economy before you get emotionally attached to the price, because the version of you standing at the gate with a personal item that legally cannot contain a personal life will not thank present you for skipping that step. And when you see a countdown timer or a message telling you how many other people are looking at the same flight, remember that regulators have already caught the travel industry fabricating exactly that kind of message before, which means the healthiest possible response to it is no response at all. Because when you go back to that seat map now, the one glowing red with a single middle seat left near the back, you're not looking at the actual state of the airplane anymore. You never were. You're looking at a color chosen because of what it does to a nervous system that hasn't fundamentally changed since 1979, running on an engine one executive built on purpose in the early 1980s, stacked together deliberately on a screen, waiting for your chest to do that small thing it wasn't doing 30 seconds ago.